I don't want to spend too much time kind of seeding the conversation today. I hope we have a fair amount of back and forth from everyone. But I did want to mention just a couple of, I think, timely or relevant examples to associations regarding data collection and data usage. One of those top examples that we see a lot is organizations will have something like some kind of annual member survey process that their members go through. And in that survey process, obviously there's an opportunity to collect a lot of information. What can happen in the absence of data governance is there might not be a lot of care or design put into what the actual survey questions are. So you might miss the opportunity to look at this data in aggregate and be able to easily draw conclusions from it. This goes back to the idea of kind of survey design. What are the processes an organization ought to put in place for governing how this data is collected, and how can that help with the strategic analysis that's performed with that data after the fact. And then another example I wanted to bring up is, mailing lists. We have some representation from the marketing function here in this breakout group. And, but marketing or not, one of the most valuable resources a lot of associations have is really their email list of contacts that they can reach out to. Some are members, prospective members, partners, et cetera. And what do you do when what is your process for collecting these email addresses? And then what are you permitted to do, or what ought your organization do with those email addresses once they're collected? That also is a data usage issue. You've collected this information on people. What's the right approach to make sure that you're communicating with them successfully, ethically, following the principles at your organization, as well as any of the best practices around email marketing and frequency of timing and things like that. So I just wanted to use those kind of two association examples as a jumping off point for our conversation. But really what we want to talk about is what are some of the guardrails, using specific examples if possible, that you can imagine having at an organization, or maybe you already have them, with regards to data collection and usage. And how is your thinking on those guardrails changed over time? Does anyone want to kind of kick it off? Maybe you've got an example of something recently that happened at your organization, or just something that is really important from the work you do.
I can speak to one good example and one bad example.
All right.
The good example is I have one client that does get regular data from outside sources. And what we do is we'll add that to the database, but we're also flagging it and put a label around it so that we know that source and that date and time. And give it a life expectancy of what we're going to do with this data over the next 6 to 9 months, 9-month period. And you don't know if you have any dead records, like the email addresses don't exist anymore, or what's that strategy, but having that in the database and then tracking that success rate. Now the client in particular both use Informs, so we're able to track that open click deliverable rate and just do that analysis. And then after a period of time, if we find out that there's no traffic in certain areas, we're going to gut those records, and then they're going to use the remaining records that are getting some traction, and then define a campaign around how to incrementally get them more involved and hopefully get them into membership. The other strategy is obviously the complete opposite, whereas they're just throwing data in and not really having any thought process of what those, how they're going to use this data. It's just garbage in and just hope for the best.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I can share kind of a fairly recent thing. This was towards the end of last year. We had an outside consultant that was hired to do a like a needs assessment survey sort of a thing. And frequently after the survey period was closed, she reached out to me and asked me for a number of like data points that we technically collect, right? The fields are there on like their member profiles and their member applications, but the quality of it kind of sucks. I mean, frankly, it's like 50% complete, right? So, and a frustrating thought that I had was, well, if these were important points that you needed, data points that you needed, why is that not being asked in, sort of your survey process? So that was just, one particular example. I'd be kind of curious, and then I think this ties into kind of what you're saying in terms of collection and usage, but, if you're doing a survey like that, a needs survey, I mean, you don't necessarily want to use that as a place to sort of, farm your content, to fill in the data gaps, because it feels a little dirty, I guess. I don't know. It's a survey where you're supposed to give your impression of something. And then if you're taking that data and then populating, their records with it, I'm not sure where the line is there. That's probably why you need a data governance policy to define those lines, right? So.
Yeah, it's definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. At CAS, we're kind of in the beginning stages or the early stages of even having like an actual marketing team. So it's exciting, but we're really taking baby steps. And so I'm finding that, there's things that we want to do, but we don't have the tools yet. We are moving to a new database, which will give us a little bit better ability to do some fine tune our marketing a bit and to actually get the data that we need as far as what we would use, because we have a lot of information in our current system that is useless because we don't use it. And I'm like, why are we even collecting this anymore? We can't, for one, because of GDPR. We have members in Europe and around the world. So we're really trying to look at what we have now, and when we move over, what's the data that we're going to take. And I have to say, we've done a pretty good job at cleaning our data. So we are very good at that. And that's just it's an issue of YM, because what you put in, we're mainly a meetings organization. We do 13 to 15 meetings a year. So people are registering, and that's their membership. There's no dues collection or anything like that. So, but when they register, that's the accurate data that gets cleaned, and then it gets uploaded into their member data, so that we always have the correct information. But moving forward, we're like, well, what are we going to bring over into the new system? We have birth date in there. We have, those kinds of pieces of information about people that we're not using, we've not used in years. So looking at it from what do you transition over to? And then from there, how do we make it easy for people to say, this is how I want you to communicate with me. I want to receive emails on this, and this topic, and that's it. And we haven't been able to get that granular before. And with 13 to 15, topics, it's really important that we get to that point that we can do that. So I think that's what I'm looking forward to in transitioning to a new system.
Cool. Yeah, there's a lot of great things in the sort of examples you all raised. One, I loved, Anne, how you brought up that you're kind of in the early stages of having a marketing team. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, because for a lot of us and a lot of our organizations, we're in some state of flux. There's some state that is changing. There's maybe new technology being added, new resources being added. So it's not, it's not completely alien that we would be in this situation where there's an opportunity to do more with data governance. And there's very often good reason why organizations haven't done more with data governance, so I think that's an important thing to note. Also, the idea of collecting more detailed information on how people want to be communicated with, that almost sounds like an example to me. It's data about the people in your email list. But it's also, in some senses, it's a little bit of metadata. It's information about how these people want to be communicated with and on what cadence. And that's information that you can use strategically with, your new email software, which is great. Andy, as you were talking about, a good example and a not so great example of having, good guardrails in place. I think it's great that you feel comfortable sharing a not so ideal example. I think that's a really important method of kind of highlighting where there's room for improvement by being able to talk frankly about, these are the processes that could be better, where there's a lot of chaos and a lack of definition. But when we think about, the different places where sort of structure can come from, it does touch on some of those external forces on your organization, right? Things like GDPR, if you fall under that, or PCI compliance, if you're dealing with things like credit card numbers within your organization. Some organizations have, internal policies or bylaws that they have to follow, and there could be other identified obligations, this idea that, we want to be ethical with this survey data and how we collect it and how we use it. How can we be transparent about it? Some of those things that Robert was alluding to earlier. Curious about the group's thoughts on kind of how should usage be restricted to protect privacy and security? And are there any standards? Another quick example before I stop talking, and I just wanted to mention that, a lot of organizations have these demographic fields that are somewhat incomplete. Robert mentioned that 50% number. And some organizations have these demographic fields that matter to them, but it's always a question of when do they get surfaced? Do they get surfaced whenever someone makes a transaction? Is that going to give them an opportunity to fill out certain demographic fields that matter to us? Or whenever they log into our member portal or attend an event? That's another example of a place where greater policy, greater understanding of how to collect and use data can be very informative and can provide relief to people who aren't sure. There's people on your teams that might be wondering, should I ask this question now or later? Or what other times are we going to have the opportunity to collect this information? I'm not sure which way to proceed because of that. Just opening it up to the group again, do you have any kind of reactions to that? Do you have additional ideas on how data usage should be restricted or is restricted at the organizations you work with? Definitely love to hear more from you all about that.
So it's interesting on the data collection thing. I was hosting a meeting to kind of talk about this because we've got a membership director and a marketing director, and both of them are fairly new to the association, like just within the last 6 months. So getting them kind of up to speed and then figuring out what data we have that they need and what data we don't have and so on. So as part of that, I went through and was I wrote out basically a whole process of like, here are the fields that we sort of ask people for, where we ask them, whether it's on their profile, whether it's part of a member application or when they first sign up and whatnot. And I thought what was really interesting is that marketing and membership had very different points where they wanted to get that data, right? Or collect the data or what data they wanted at which point. So like membership was like, no. When they just like first create their account, I don't want to like overwhelm them with like their life story. And she was like, it's like a first date, right? And then when they come and join, that's, when you're starting to get a little serious, you learn a little bit more about them and so on. And then they attend an event and then it's getting real serious. We're not going to ask for like social security numbers, but you know what I mean? But so I thought that was a really interesting way of framing that. But then marketing, on the other hand, was like, no, the first time they fill out a form, we need all their info. And I'm like, maybe a little aggressive. So somewhere in the middle, I think is where the balance needs to be. Because, at the moment, and again, it just ties back into like what I was talking about in terms of the quality of our data and how much of it is just sort of missing. Is I'm not sure how we get people to the forms that we want them to fill out without making interacting with us like an oppressive experience, where we don't want to like just grill them constantly every time they want to do something like register for a webinar. We want them to have a nice one click experience, right? So
we that's funny that you say that. We had we work with a graphics firm, and they were going through our website before we moved to a new website, but they were going through our old website. And it's the YM portion of trying to register for a conference. And he said, if it takes me 9 clicks, 9 screens to get through before I can actually register as a new person, someone who's not in your system yet, he's like, you lost me at step 4. Like, he's like, and that's being, easy on you. So that's been the one complaint from our members also, is just that it takes so many screens to get through before you actually can register for the meeting. So that we are really looking forward to streamlining that. Like, what is the basic? And this wasn't necessarily that we felt we needed all this information. It's just sort of historical that it's been this way. So, but everyone's excited to have, let's make it 2 screens. That's it.
Yeah, and user experience is also one of, I was talking about privacy and security, but the quality of the user experience can also be one of the frames with which you describe the usage of having a data collection and usage policy, so that you make sure that that's really kept intact.
I want to throw in just one quick thing on this that's really difficult in 52 seconds is DE&I data that I've talked to associations about, that they're trying to measure the success of DEI initiatives, but to do so, they need baseline data. To get baseline data, they've got to ask people really personal questions, and how to do that is really challenging for them. And that some that have done it are having challenges with their members, like, why are you asking? Even though they've held a webinar and they've sent emails and they've explained the context, it still feels bad for them. So it's just something else in the mix here.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great one. I know that's come up a lot with many of our clients. So we have a kind of 10 seconds here, but I just want to leave the door open to, if you want to volunteer to summarize our conversation, you are more than welcome to do so. If not, I'm happy to take care of it, and I'll see you all.